So thank you and good morning, colleagues. My name is Keisha García and I serve as the National Biodiversity Planning and Reporting Specialist for the preparation of Trinidad and Tobago's 6th National Report to the Convention on Biological Diversity. So just very quickly before starting today, I would like to thank the UNDP for the opportunity to make this presentation on behalf of the government of Trinidad and Tobago. As a part of implementing the 6th National Report process here in Trinidad and Tobago, there were some very important insights that we were able to identify, a number of which are especially relevant for SIDS. And so we are therefore very happy to have a chance to speak about these today. My presentation today will be focused on our 6th National Reporting process and some of the lessons that we've learned, especially in relation to data accessibility and applicability. So just to provide a background, we had a very well-organized process here in Trinidad and Tobago with some strong technical and administrative leadership. We were led by the local UNDP office and our Ministry of Planning and Development. We had a national steering committee that was convened and comprised of members with strong technical backgrounds. We had strong involvement and cooperation from all of our main stakeholder groups. And we attempted all 7 sections of the 6th National Report, although we were cognizant that we were not able to complete certain sections in full detail, such as the one on indigenous knowledge and local contributions to biodiversity management, simply because we don't have the data. But the 6th NR wasn't without its challenges here in Trinidad and Tobago. Some of those are persistent challenges and some were in fact quite specific to the 6th NR process. And I'm just going to highlight some of those now. Our revised National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, which includes our national targets, were only approved by our cabinet in April of 2018, and that gave us a very short monitoring time frame in order to prepare our 6th National Report. As well, the 5th National Report, which was a very comprehensive report, was completed in October of 2016, and we had very limited new data to work with for the 6th National Report. Then we had the issue of the new expectations and requirements that were a part of the 6th National Report, especially related to spatial data and gender-related data, which we had to come to terms with. And we have had a persistent challenge here relating to biodiversity data collection in Trinidad and Tobago because our clearinghouse is not fully populated or maintained, meaning that I had to go as the person leading this process to every agency individually to try to collect whatever the data and information they have. Now, what I want to reflect on are some of the lessons that we learned here in Trinidad and Tobago, not only from the 6th National Report, but also from foregoing reports, such as the 5th and 4th reports. And these could help to address some of the challenges that we are facing in our national reporting process. One of the most salient lessons we learned is that national policy priorities should really establish the foundation for biodiversity goals and targets, and that global framework should be retrofitted to these national policy priorities, not the other way around. Why do I say that? Well, because here in TNT, there was a very early attempt to cover all of the global IT targets and to develop national targets and indicators against these. But the result was a list of 20 targets and 97 accompanying indicators. And the 5th National Report back in 2016 identified that Trinidad and Tobago simply did not have the data to monitor or measure the greater majority of these. There was therefore an attempt in our revised NBSAP to reduce this list and to prioritize targets and indicators most relevant for Trinidad and Tobago. But again, even through this process, which was widely consultative, the policy priorities were not brought sharply into focus. And so even our truncated list that existed within the NBSAP for our national targets were not a true reflection of our national priorities. And we also gave inadequate attention to the systems for monitoring and evaluating within the NBSAP for the priorities we identified. The overall result is that in the 6th NR, we were unable to provide a comprehensive assessment of progress against our national targets, even the prioritized ones. So in moving forward, what was therefore recommended is that TNT focuses on 3 main drivers or threats to our local biodiversity. And these have been identified since the 5th National Report as land use and land cover change, which is a top priority for most SIDS, if not all, adaptation to climate change, which is another SIDS priority, and unsustainable use of our local biodiversity resources, which affects, again, most, if not all SIDS. These are drivers for which we have comprehensive and relatively long-term data sets, so the threats are well established and relatively well understood. What has been discussed and what we need to move towards here in TNT is the establishment of our local biodiversity goals and targets based on these 3 priorities, especially considering where there may be intersections between and amongst them, because these intersections could allow us to identify critical entry points for policy, meaning that we could potentially create multiplier effects in the interventions that we design. We would thereby reduce our monitoring effort, and by extension, evaluation and reporting could become far more onerous and far more streamlined. But let me say that the government of Trinidad and Tobago has already begun to move in this direction. There are efforts to improve land use through the design of a more holistic policy approach that encompasses both biodiversity and climate change considerations at its core. And there have also been more concerted efforts to improve our system of managing protected areas through the design and implementation of a number of policy support tools and metrics. Trinidad and Tobago is undoubtedly, we are on the right trajectory, but what is needed is a little pep in our step. We need to move faster to keep up with the rate of intensification of our drivers. This is the main problem. I want to switch now to speak about another lesson that we have learned over the years, one which relates to the type of data and information that are most relevant from the reporting and decision-making standpoints. So I'll begin this section by looking at the positives, the things that we are already doing in TNT. But what I wish to do as I move along is to point out what we have identified as further needs. So if you look at some of our previous national reports, you will realize that there are certain indicators for which we have very good baselines and strong historic data. And many of these do in fact correspond with the priorities that have been identified, those that I spoke about earlier. So here we have the change in total forested area in Trinidad since 1970, and that's tracked nearly annually. Here we have the area covered by our plantation forests, tracked since 1990 on an annual basis. We also track our mean long-term annual temperature. As you can see, it's increasing here in Trinidad and Tobago. And in Trinidad, we do in fact have some good spatial data for some of our indicators. So here you see a land use or land cover map that was updated in 2007. And we do have a corresponding map for Tobago. Here we have a recently updated protected areas map generated by the government in 2018. Now, we have some good applied data sets in Trinidad as well. But a part of the challenge that we face with our applied data sets relate to keeping these up to date. So here we have a tracking of our land use between 1991 and 2010, and it's expressed spatially. So you could see the change in different human uses over time. Here you see the evolution of Trinidad and Tobago's urban footprint between 1991 and 2010 growing substantially, I should say. This map is, this graph, is a graph that shows the forest outturn from our natural forest between 2010 and 2014. And what this is showing us is the extent to which logging is illegally occurring in our natural forests. So from this, we can directly track the impact of deforestation on some of our most biologically rich habitats. This chart here shows you the way that fire is affecting some of our ecosystems. And these data are far more important than simply having a log of the number and sizes of fires that are occurring nationally. This tells us about the direct impact of a human-induced activity on different types of ecosystems, especially ones like our natural forests. This chart here shows us the change in freshwater withdrawal as a percentage of the total renewable freshwater resources in Trinidad and Tobago, indicating the impact that we are having on some of our local resources and the ability of our local natural resources to keep up with our demand, in this case, fresh water. Okay, this final map here is an ecosystem services map, which spatially expresses the extent of coastal protection afforded by the coral reefs, mangroves, and seagrass beds in Tobago's southwestern area. The map has directly been used in decision-making about where and how physical development should occur in this area of Tobago. And this is an area which is very popular for both tourism activities and the development of housing and other infrastructure. The idea in showing you all of this data is to show what we consider to be most useful from a decision-making standpoint. But what I want to emphasize after showing you those data sets is that while we are in fact on the right track, we need to ensure that data and information that underpin decision-making are updated systematically so that we have greater confidence in the interventions being prescribed. Of course, once this is done, you can imagine that national reporting would become quite a bit less onerous. But this perhaps is easier said than done. And this is because, like most small island states, Trinidad and Tobago lacks the capacity to monitor and collect environmental data. And this is a relatively widespread and persistent problem for which there are no easy solutions. Now, it might be worth mentioning very quickly here that in TNT, we do have a national environmental fund known as the Green Fund, and that capitalizes on a tax that is mandatory for all registered businesses. Last count, this fund held $880 million US. So we do have an opportunity here to fund some of the work that we need. But there are amendments in the law and in administration of the fund that will be required to allow for monies to be redirected to support the type of research that we need to meet our national biodiversity goals and targets. I can't say too much about this right now because I think I'm already almost out of time. So what I want to speak a little bit now about is addressing the issue of scale in the collection and application of data, especially for SIDS, because like many SIDS, Trinidad and Tobago faces this problem. The chart that I've included on this slide shows a map that was generated by the UN Biodiversity Lab for use in our 6th national report, and it expresses the protected areas in Trinidad and Tobago based on data sets accessed globally. Now, when you compare this map with what I would have showed you in slide 15, there are a few discrepancies. And what this highlighted for us in Trinidad and Tobago is that our geographical scale is so small that global spatial data sets will often not provide the level of accuracy that is desirable, meaning, therefore, that we need to find ways of investing in the generation of spatial data that is more locally applicable. And again, Trinidad and Tobago is on the right track, but more work is certainly required. In this map here, I show you the value of carbon sequestration services from our forest and coastal ecosystems. This was done as a part of the Pro-EcoServe project undertaken in Trinidad between 2010 and 2015 under the overall aegis of the UN Environment. And it uses a combination of local and global data to try to generate the most accurate map possible. These maps are from a different project led by the University of the West Indies. The project was known as García. And what these maps show is the change in distribution of vascular plants across Trinidad based on climate modeling. And what the scientists did here was that they used the IPCC AR5 models and they downscaled the temperature and rainfall data for Trinidad. And then they overlaid the most recent floral data from an in-depth local study on vascular plants to look at how the distribution of these plants would change under various climate scenarios. But this type of data is really what gets to the heart of decision making on climate change adaptation measures that are required locally, including the designation of protected areas. So similarly, under the same Golo-García project, these maps here were done using downscale climate data for Trinidad, and they consider the impact of various climate change scenarios on an important agricultural crop in Trinidad, cocoa or Theobroma cacao. But not surprisingly, at the higher RCPs or representative concentration pathways, and these are the temperature changes, we expect to see greater impacts on the ability to grow this crop locally. This potentially affects many local farmers who depend on cocoa sales for their livelihoods. Now in this slide, the global climate models were used to consider the impact of sea level rise on a beach in northeastern Trinidad that is considered a critical nesting ground for leatherback turtles. And what it shows is that under certain climate models, the entire beach could be expected to be inundated and lost, and this would have devastating consequences for turtle nesting and the associated local livelihood. Now, the sixth NR process also allowed us to consider additional types of data sets and support that are required to improve our decision-making and actions related to the biodiversity here in TNT. I specifically want to highlight the importance of platforms such as the UN Biodiversity Lab in this regard. This map that I show was generated for us by the lab, showing the spatial distribution of our threatened species. And this is a major gap in our local data collection. In discussions with local stakeholders, we identified that maps such as these are critical in helping to manage our biodiversity. But at present, we do not have these types of data at our scale. Recognizing that it will take quite a bit of time for us to generate the necessary data, one important thing that we did was to use the UN Biodiversity Lab to start the conversation about how to collect and use these types of data locally. And it's on this point that I want to highlight that platforms such as the UN Biodiversity Lab offer SIDS a wonderful opportunity to improve our data banks, especially spatial data, where these data are locally lacking. The lab could provide technical support, and it could also help to facilitate the exchange of data and information and expertise, whether this be between local and global stakeholders or even amongst local stakeholders who don't usually speak with each other. So some final thoughts. The first is that SIDS present an opportunity for such studies at a smaller scale, and we are like laboratories. So we can undertake studies in our SIDS that have the opportunity for transfer and adaptation, even upscaling in certain instances. But I want to emphasize one of my earlier points about having clearly defined national policy priorities on which to develop targets, because this would help to make biodiversity monitoring, reporting, and management more efficient and streamlined, rather than going the other way around, where small islands and countries in general are always chasing after changing global agendas. Now, it would also help, in addition, let me say here quickly, to save some time, money, and effort, because we found that in our 6th national report, the gender perspective was not as important to Trinidad and Tobago as in other places. But once we understood this, we were able to relate to the CBD what we were willing to cover based on our local circumstances. The next point is that don't wait for perfect data. Start the conversation with the best available science that you have. And such as in the case with the data we got from the UN Biodiversity Lab, use what you have to begin discussions about policies and actions. And the last point is, it is very important, especially in SIDS, to have a central repository for data and information, such as a clearinghouse, because this does increase efficiency of the process for national reporting. And it does help to underpin a strong biodiversity portfolio. Thank you.